Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the APAN webinar, Enhancing Regional Cooperation for Transformative Adaptation in the Asia Pacific, Key Barriers, Enablers, and Policy Insights. My name is Akane Matsuo. I'm a policy researcher of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES, based in Japan. I'm going to be your moderator for this 2-hour session today. So the technical webinar series is one of the flagship activities of APAN to enhance the understanding of adaptation practitioners on the key outcomes of the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. And today's topic is Transformative Adaptation, which was the main theme of the 8th APAN Forum last year, and also one of the key topics of the upcoming COP29 adaptation negotiation. So to continue advancing regional efforts on transformative adaptation, APAN, in collaboration with IGES and ICCCAD, have conducted policy study on this topic this year. And today we are delighted to share the initial outcomes and some insights with our partners. So can you go to a session objective slide? Thank you. So the objectives of today's session are to firstly present the current challenges in promoting transformative adaptation and explore available solutions and identify key actors that need to be involved, and then share and discuss key policy recommendations, pathways, and enablers in achieving transformative adaptation. And finally, engage and discuss and validate with government agencies and international organizations about the prospects for transformative adaptation in the region. So the webinar will also seek to identify actionable steps for countries and stakeholders ahead of COP29. Can you go to the overview slides? Thank you. So in this session, we will join by UNEP ROAP Deputy Regional Director and Ministry of Environment Japan Deputy Director for the opening session, and SPREP at the closing session. At the center of this webinar is a dialogue where we will hear results of the policy study on the transformative adaptation from IGES and ICCCAD, and then followed by the reflection from the WRI. Then we will move into panel discussions with policymakers and relevant organizations. So we will have a Q&A session at the end of the program, so please feel free to ask questions to the panelists through Q&A chat box shown in your Zoom screen at any time during the webinar. Also, please be informed that this will be a recorded session. So without further ado, let's move to an opening session. May I invite Mr. Moazarul Alam to introduce the session. He is the Regional Coordinator, Climate Action, UNEP Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, and Head of Secretariat of the APAN. Babu, over to you.
Thank you so much, Akane, for introduction, as well as also mentioning about the objectives of the webinar. Let me start thanking Merlin, Yoko, and all the speakers who joined us today, as well as the participants who will be listening, as well as contributing to this webinar on enhancing the regional cooperation for transformative adaptation in the Asia and the Pacific region. Since 2009, Asia Pacific Adaptation Network has been mobilizing adaptation knowledge to support action at different levels, including the global processes, the regional, the forum, as well as the national level activities. As many of you know, the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network allows the flexibility to foster the new partnership to address the emerging adaptation needs, as well as the needs identified during the adaptation forum, as Akane, you have mentioned, as well as the other processes, including the COP. During the last Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum, we have touched upon both the transformative adaptation as well as the loss and damage. So for enhancing the understanding on the loss and damage, the global goal on adaptation, which includes both the incremental as well as the transformative adaptation, as well as under the global goal on adaptation, we also have the targets and the indicators. So enhancing the understanding on all those areas, we felt that is a greater need in the Asia Pacific region. So as a part of that need, we have already delivered series of webinars on loss and damage, the global goal on adaptation, the targets and indicators, as well as we have published the information note, which we have circulated. We have circulated it's almost 8,000 people. And thanks for all the colleagues and the participants who contributed to the earlier webinar, as well as publishing the information note. This technical webinar is a part of that series, as I have mentioned, and your advice and engagement, as well as use of the APAN, the knowledge product, are key aspects of our success. The generous support that we have received since the inception of APAN Forum from the government of Japan allowed us to keep working on the adaptation knowledge, including the issues emerging over time, including the COP26, which is obviously one of the milestones in terms of the adaptation areas of work. I also would like to thank all the partners who contributed in the past and who will be contributing this event as well as in the future work of APAN. I'd like to thank Matsuo-san for taking the responsibility to moderate our session, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Babu, for providing us with recent APAN's activities and clear background of today's session. So now I'd like to invite Ms. Mariel Nelson for formally opening the webinar. She's the Deputy Regional Director of the UNEP Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Nelson, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone joining us from across the Asian Pacific and beyond. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on enhancing regional cooperation for transformative adaptation in the Asian Pacific, key barriers, enablers, and policy insight. Can you hear me? Because I got a message saying that I need to be unmuted.
No, hear you well, Marlene. Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Then there was just something popped up saying unmute yourself. Okay, I'm glad you can hear me. I'm also thrilled that UNEP, alongside the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies and the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, is co-leading this session today. This, as Babu mentioned, this webinar is part of the APAN technical webinar series designed to keep adaptation practitioners up to date on emerging trends, insights, and lessons from the global climate changes discourse. Today's session will focus on the critical need for transformative adaptation, a concept gaining traction in global climate talks. We are living in a time when climate change is reshaping every facet of our lives. In recent years, we've seen how the Asian Pacific region has borne the brunt of extreme weather events, from record floods to unbearable heat waves. In 2022, over 64 million people in our region were affected by extreme weather, causing untold damages to lives and economies. Science tells us that these events will only become more frequent and severe. These impacts not only threaten our economies, but also undermine decades of development progress. We must act urgently and collectively to buffer against these consequences. Adaptation is no longer a choice. It is an imperative for survival. Adaptation enables societies to adjust to the realities of climate change. But today we must go further. We need transformative adaptation, which goes beyond incremental adjustment to fundamentally shift the way our ecological, social, and economic systems operate in the face of climate risks. This approach is gaining momentum, as seen as last year's 8th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum and at this year's UNFCCC National Adaptation Plan Expo. However, we still need clear pathways to achieve this transformation, and that's why today's discussions are so vital. We at UNEP work with countries across the globe to develop national adaptation plans, which outline the adaptation actions needed to safeguard societies. Through cutting-edge research, we support science-based decision-making to help countries transition to climate resilience, unlock finances, and empower communities to adapt to the changing climate. Together with IGES and ICCCAD, we have conducted a policy study to explore the barriers, enablers, and policy solutions for transformative adaptation. Today, we will hear from leading voices in government, academia, and civil society to discuss how we can turn these concepts into concrete actions. Through these insights, we aim to strengthen the narrative around transformative adaptation and identify actionable policy solutions for the region. I urge all of you to participate actively in today's discussions, ask bold questions, and share your valuable insights. It is together that we can pave the way for transformative adaptation and ensure resilience for all. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks, which is really encouraging for all of us involved in these adaptation efforts in this region. Now, may I invite Ms. Yuko Yoshida for the opening remarks. She is the Deputy Director, Climate Change Adaptation Office, Global Environment Bureau, Ministry of the Environment, Japan. Yoshida-san, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Akane-san. So good morning and good afternoon to all. On behalf of the Ministry of the Environment of the Government of Japan, I would like to acknowledge Marlene Nielsen, UNEP Deputy Regional Director, Tagaloa Cooper, Climate Adaptation Director of SPREP, IGES colleagues, online participants, and speakers. Thank you for participating in this important knowledge session on transformational adaptation. Considered as an emerging concept within the adaptation pillar of climate action, transformational adaptation has captured the attention of countries as a new beacon for achieving their respective adaptation goals. Past climate action staging events, both at the regional and global levels, such as the ACE APAN Forum in Korea in 2023 and the NAP Expo in Bangladesh this year, adapted themes along the lines of transformational adaptation, a testament to the growing recognition of the concept as a new pathway forward to implement adaptation work and achieve global resilience. Through now considered a byword, transformational adaptation is still an enigma for us. Without a concrete definition, transformational adaptation is an abstract narrative needing further discussion and clarity. Throughout the plenary and we tried to deep dive into along with the preconditions and pathways. Joining other countries, Japan is very much interested in this catalytic work on transformational adaptation. MOEJ recognizes the value of deepening understandings of transformational adaptation, as well as the recommended actions, particularly within policy perspective, which will serve as a staging point for all efforts towards its achievement. We supported the post-forum activity of the APAN Secretariat, together with IGES, in the conduct of a policy study on transformational adaptation. From the current work, APAN and IGES had gone through a rigorous process of distilling the concept with inputs from various leading organizations who are also joining us today. The reality is that while we dedicated our time and our energy to developing adaptation actions, climate change impacts are also dynamic and are evolving at a very fast pace. Climate change is here, and even though we bring all global greenhouse gas emissions to zero, we will continue to experience the devastating impacts of climate change. 2024 is the hottest year ever recorded, with deadly repercussions to countries such as the heat waves in South Asia, floods in Africa, and drought in Southeast Asia. Indeed, after year after year, climate change does not fail to let us feel its impacts with the strings of strong typhoons, drought, and other extreme weather events, resulting in mortality, economic losses, increased disasters, displacement, and other social impacts with serious implications on our globally connected economies and communities. Hence, we need to ramp up our adaptation efforts and see to it that is implement actions that are transformational in nature to safeguard and sustain our development gains. It's imperative for us to protect the significant gains and the progress achieved while we ensure that we keep up with the momentum of changing climate impacts. Japan has been supporting and will continue to be supportive of adaptation initiatives with the aim to strengthen resilience of the Asia-Pacific region. This is reflected with the continued effort support the Ministry of the Environment of the Government of Japan is providing to the Asia-Pacific Adaptation Network as a leading adaptation knowledge mobilization platform, sharing the adaptation knowledge sessions and most notably the APAN Forum to ensure science-based adaptation knowledge is available for the region. Japan is also supporting the Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Information Platform, APPLAT, which is an online information platform supporting science-based decision-making across the Asia-Pacific. Capacity building activities are also being supported in collaboration with the Regional Resource Center of the Asian Institute of Technology. We hope that through this webinar, we will be able to provide our adaptation practitioners with new insights into the pathways, enablers, and conditions to achieve transformational adaptation. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a fruitful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoshida-san, for your opening remarks and encouraging today's discussion for further enhancing collective adaptation efforts in the region. So now we'd like to move on to interactive session, which is the pre-webinar survey through Zoom poll. So now you are seeing the poll survey on your screen. So they're very simple 4 questions. So please kindly answer those questions and you will see the result on the screen meantime. Can we see the results of survey on the screen? Maybe there might be some issue showing the results of the survey. So we just wanted to know about the participants, like from which region or which sector you are joining from, to help understand the characteristic of participants, but never mind. So yeah, thank you very much for your cooperation answering the questions. We will refer those information to further enhance the webinar in the future. Okay, now we are showing the result. So in this seminar, we have good representatives from both male and female. The countries, I think we cannot see, but for the organizations, well, surprisingly, the balance is really good, like both from NGO, international organization, government, academia, and even private sector. We covered all the important sectors. So thank you very much. Yes. So once again, thank you very much for cooperating by answering the questions. Okay, so now we'd like to move to the main part of our webinar, starting from the brief explanation of the background of the Transformative Adaptation Framework study. Now, I'd like to hand the floor over to Dr. Kei Kurushima. She's a policy researcher from IGES. Kurushima-san, floor is yours.
Thank you, Akane, for the introduction. I am Kei Kurushima from IGES, and I would like to explain about the background of our Transformative Adaptation Framework study. Next slide, please. So I would like to explain how this policy brief came about initially, although in the opening remarks, some explanation was made. This policy brief all started with the 8th APAN Forum, and the theme of the forum was Resilience for All, Enabling Transformative Implementation. And in this forum, we capture the region's collective understanding and consensus about transformative adaptation. And following this APAN Forum, at the Asia Pacific Climate Weeks, the APCW, in October 2023, the APAN presented the 4 characteristics of transformative adaptation, which were restructuring, path shifting, system-wide, and just inclusive. So following the discussions in the 8th APAN Forum and the Asia Pacific Climate Weeks, the need to develop a policy brief emerged from the recognition that moving beyond point-to-point discussion is essential, and it requires more in-depth studies on the transformative adaptation characteristics and come up with actionable recommendations, particularly for policymakers and government officials. Next, please. So this recognition of the need to prepare such a policy brief prompted the APAN Secretariat to seek collaboration with IGES. So IGES has been one of the partner organizations of APAN, having been an active participant in the APAN Forum and other knowledge development and sharing activities. And since IGES has experience on research and initiatives on climate change adaptation, we were chosen to collaborate with APAN in the development of policy brief. Also, as Yoshida-san has mentioned, both APAN and IGES are the partners of the Asian Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Information Platform, or we call APPLAT. We decided to collaborate with ICCCAD, which is also the partners of APPLAT and partners of APAN, to develop the policy brief together and contribute to knowledge development and partnerships in Asia Pacific. So APAN, IGES, and ICCCAD have been working together since May of this year to conduct research and develop into a policy brief. So I am very delightful today that we can present the result of the policy brief and discuss with the stakeholders here to enhance transformative adaptation in the Asia Pacific region. Okay, yeah, I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kurushima-san, for explaining the background of this study. So now, before diving into the detail of the policy brief, let me welcome Ms. Madiha Chaudhary, who will introduce some interesting case studies of transformative adaptation. So she is the Senior Research Officer, Nature, People and Climate Program, ICCCAD. Now I hand the floor back to Kurushima-san for the detailed explanation of the policy brief.
Okay, thank you very much. So the policy brief, as I explained, was developed by IGES, ICCCAD, and APAN. So the presentation in introducing our policy brief will be made by myself and Madiha from ICCCAD. So the title of our policy brief is Enhancing Regional Cooperation for Transformative Adaptation in the Asia-Pacific Key Barriers, Enablers, and Policy Insights. Can you go to the next slide? So the content of our presentation is based on the contents of our policy brief. And first, I will explain about the problem setting objectives, methodologies, and results. And I will hand over to Madiha for her to present about the case studies. And then I will again come back here to present about the policy recommendations and way forward. So next, please. First, about the problem setting. The discussion of transformative approach became increasingly recognized following the limitation of the incremental approach for climate change adaptation. Here, I wrote the definition of incremental adaptation and transformative adaptation by IPCC. And incremental adaptation is defined as adaptation actions where the central aim is to maintain the essence and integrity of a system or process at a given scale. While transformative adaptation, in the presentation, I will write transformative adaptation as TA because to shorten it, so please note that TA means transformative adaptation. So transformative adaptation is defined as adaptation that changes the fundamental attributes of a system in response to climate and its effect. So here, although I explained about the definition of transformative adaptation, I would just like to note that although many previous researches refer to the definition of the IPCC, the unification of definition is not yet clear. But in the policy brief, instead of focusing on the unification of definition and defining transformative adaptation, we focus on advancing actions and measures that contribute to transformative adaptation so that we can foster a society resilient to the dynamic impacts of climate change. Also, since the discussion started with the 8th APAN Forum in Asia Pacific, we would also like to emphasize the importance of fostering regional collaboration for transformative adaptation in Asia Pacific. Next, please. So there are 5 objectives for our policy brief. I will go through it briefly. The first objective is to frame the essential building blocks necessary for transformative adaptation across the identified characteristics. And the characteristics, as I explained earlier, that was identified last year at the IPCW was restructuring, path shifting, system-wide, and just inclusive. And we also would like to underline the interconnectedness of these characteristics. And the second objective is to provide examples of transformative adaptation from Asia-Pacific countries, highlighting specific geolocation and context of evidence. Thirdly, define entry points, pathways, processes, and actors in achieving transformative adaptation. The fourth objective is to identify barriers and challenges in achieving transformative adaptation. And lastly, to provide policy recommendations. Next slide, please. So I would like to briefly explain about the methodologies that we use to develop this policy brief. First, in order to explore the standpoints of relevant organizations, we conduct literature review with interviews with the following guiding questions. The guiding questions focus on the definition and potential impact of a common definition on the international community. Secondly, the examples of initiatives of transformative adaptation, conditions and key actors for success, and challenges and solutions in shifting from incremental to transformative adaptations. The second major methodology that we use is analysis of adaptation communications of the Asia-Pacific countries, including the NAPs and other related adaptation documents. In the analysis, we explored how the concept of transformative adaptation is described in the adaptation plans of each country. The third methodology is exploring the case studies of transformative adaptation in Asia-Pacific regions. And for these case studies, we selected from sub-regional groups defined by climatological and ecological characteristics. Next, please. Okay, so next I would like to move on to the result of our research. The first result is on the perspective of organizations. So for this result, I have 2 slides, and I have organized into 4 topics. The first one is definition. The second is examples of transformative adaptation. The third one in the next slide will be condition and key actors for realizing transformative adaptation. And the fourth is barriers and solutions. So for the result of the definitions, firstly, many organizations reference the IPCC's definition of transformative adaptation, but recognize the need to establish a common definition or understanding in the region. And secondly, so the third one, concepts such as systematic change and paradigm shift are often employed. And also many organizations recognize the need to establish, Okay, so the concepts such as systematic change and paradigm shift are often employed for the transformative adaptation. And also it is important to note that in the UNFCCC, the United Arab Emirates Framework for Global Climate Resilience, which was adopted at the last COP28, it says that the framework should guide and strengthen efforts, including long-term transformational and incremental adaptation towards reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity and resilience. For the result of the examples, so at the 8th APAN Forum, it emphasized the importance of considering cross-sectoral approaches. But the most examples from the survey are cases from particular sectors, such as agriculture and infrastructure. And as for the example, several organizations highlighted land use changes, including relocation against sea level rise. Next, please. Moving on to the conditions and key results of the conditions and key actors. The findings were that top-down leadership by government, traditional leaders, and funder is necessary, especially in reforming national policies and regulations to achieve transformative adaptation. And secondly, long-term perspective and cross-sector efforts should be considered for the successful transformative adaptation when formulating national adaptation plans. And also it is important to promote innovation through research and design by research and the private sector. And the last point is inclusive participation from civil society and local actors, including marginalized community, should be encouraged in decision-making. For the result of challenges and solutions enabling transformative adaptation, more than half of surveyed organizations underscored the importance of developing the funding mechanism for transformative adaptation. And it was also pointed out that lack of recognition on transformative adaptation and society's reluctance to move beyond established practices could be the fundamental barrier. And so taking into account these challenges and barriers, I would like to share 2 solutions discussed. The first one is they suggested solutions to include aligning finance with sustainable development and make it more long-term and predictable, and also to incorporate transformative adaptation into adaptation plans. And another solution is ensuring recognition of transformative adaptation through all ministries and agencies and fostering continuous cross-sector learning, as well as visualizing related actions through just transition. Okay, next, please. The net result for the adaptation communication analysis. So we conducted survey for 39 Asian Pacific countries. And for 19 countries that have submitted the NAPs, we analyzed the NAPs. And for other countries, other 19 countries that does not have the NAPs, we analyzed the national communication, adaptation communication, and nationally determined contributions. So what we focus on when we did the analysis is whether transformative adaptation is mentioned in the document, and if yes, how it is mentioned. So as a result, we categorized the countries into 3 categories. The first category is countries that explicitly incorporate transformative adaptation as a core objective of their plans. And this category comprised of 6 countries. Some examples written in the NAPs were from the Bangladesh NAPs. It was written, this NAP comprises structure and persistent pathways for transformation in climate change adaptation and climate resilient development towards fulfilling the dream of Sona Bangla. And also in the NAPs of Philippines, it was mentioned that the aim of the NAP are to steadily reduce climate-related losses and damages and optimize opportunities for mitigation, facilitate transformative adaptation, and promote resilient, sustainable development. The second category is the countries that refer to transformative adaptation in their plans, but only limited to specific activities or sectors. The second country comprised of 7 countries. And I took example from Fiji and India. And in their NAP, it says the agricultural sector is identified within the National Development Plan as a transformational thrust for Fiji's development. And in the India's NAPs, it says the country is now poised to make a transformational shift from women in Swachhata to women-led Swachhata. So the final category here is countries that do not mention transformative adaptation. And this is the biggest group, which comprises of 26 countries. So from this result, we can see that some countries have started to incorporate transformative adaptation in their adaptation plans, but we need to work more toward mobilizing as much country as possible in the Asia-Pacific region. Next, please. So from here, I would like to hand over to Madiha to present about the case studies that ICCCAD has conducted. So Madiha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabe. So hello, everyone. I am Madiha Chaudhry, and I lead the Nature, People, and Climate program at the International Center for Climate Change and Development. Next slide, please. So I'll basically be presenting the section that we have in our policy study on case studies of transformational adaptation within the Asia-Pacific region. And so basically, we have tried to filter and select these case studies in a methodological and systemic manner to ensure a couple of factors. Firstly, we aimed to represent a variety of hazards. And as we know, the Asia-Pacific region is the most vulnerable to climate change, being prone to multiple hazards. So we selected countries from sub-regions which are defined by climatological and ecological features. And accordingly, that was our way of ensuring that we represent a variety of hazards. Apart from that, so I'll not go into the details of the sub-regions, but the mentioned sub-region those regions are most prone to those hazards. We've also tried to represent a variety of impacted sectors, and these are the most impacted sectors that we have found from the literature within the Asia-Pacific region: the coastal communities, the ecosystems and biodiversity, health, water, and agriculture. Apart from that, we've also tried to represent a variety of the typology of adaptation responses, and this particular categorization of the adaptation responses has been adopted from the first ever global stocktake of adaptation responses within the academic literature. And just a key note that study found that behavioral or cultural and technological and infrastructure are the two most documented types of adaptation responses in this particular region. So alongside these, through and through, we also prioritize the least developed countries and the small island development states, which, while also considering the submission of national adaptation plans within these countries for further analysis. Next slide. So we've basically chalked this out into 3 case studies, and the first case study basically is pivotal around the South or the Pacific region, the South Tropical Asia, which mainly consists of the Pacific Islands. So we're here mainly dealing with the impacted sector being coastal communities, which are susceptible to sea level rise and erosion. And the type of adaptation response that's covered here is both behavioral, that is the act of relocation, and institutional as well, that is changes within the policies and plans. Now, before going into some details about this case study, I would just like everyone to start thinking about whether relocation can be termed transformational all in all, because superficially, the concept has the tendency of striking many as transformational owing to the magnitude of radicalism that's involved here. So many of the low-lying Pacific Island states, as we know, are at high risk of losing inhabitable lands to sea level rise, and human mobility is very common in these areas. Now, Fiji's planned relocation practices and guidelines have been cited by many scholars and literature as transformational adaptation. So, for instance, in 2014, an entire community was relocated within this particular village, and this happened 8 years after the request was placed by the locals to the government. So basically, the initiative was taken by the locals and further supported by the government. And it also included extensive consultations and local level leadership, which was basically key to buy-in consensus among the villagers for moving in back. And diversified livelihood options were also created at the site of relocation. So overall, this particular case of Fiji it basically ensured both adaptation as well as positive human development, and hence we classify it as being something that's transformative. But something to be noted here is that the proximity of the lands between which the relocation took place helped overcome the most significant challenge that's involved with relocation. That is basically ensuring that the social configuration or the roots of these islanders don't get disrupted. Now, Fiji's case was an example of basically a reactive type of transformational adaptation, moving into more of proactive or anticipatory TA, which are basically the institutional types of responses. We have a couple of examples or cases here, such as Tuvalu has its long-term adaptation plan in place, which basically prioritizes safety beyond the year 2100. So it acknowledges the social barriers regarding migration, and accordingly, the plan has designed a range of options. Other than that, the Marshall Islands NAP also considers adaptation pathways and tipping points, and it basically proposes the development of local adaptation plan. But again, the government of Marshall Island also prioritizes maintaining sovereignty and in situ adaptation. But at the same time, it also acknowledges that at some point in the future, relocation might be inevitable. And bringing in a case from the Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, because the coastal communities and riverine communities in this country are also highly prone to erosion and thus losing their inhabitable lands. So an initiative called Climate Resilient Migrant Friendly Towns, the concept is being materialized through local plans, which are being developed for potential secondary towns. Now, secondary towns is basically, the idea is they are situated adjacent to the coastal communities, so that these communities are able to migrate into these adjacent secondary towns, which have similar sociocultural context. And so the local plans are targeted to develop these towns to increase their absorptive capacity for the incoming migrants. And these plans are basically being developed through a participatory approach, embedding the 8 principles of locally led adaptation. Now, overall, for major takeaways from this, let's circle back to our starting question, that whether relocation in the first place is transformational. And we derive that the degree of transformation of a relocation is basically determined by multiple factors, and these range from the planning process to the actors involved to the ecological, social, and economic challenges. Again, being transformational does not necessarily ensure positive outcomes and may also turn out to be maladaptive. For instance, currently the challenge that Bangladesh is facing is the relocation of these displaced coastal communities to the slums of the crowded capital, which does not ensure climate justice for the migrants and mostly disrupts their social configurations. And causes more losses and damages at the place of their migration. Now, overcoming such barriers requires a very delicate balance between being anticipatory and reactive, which we've seen with Marshall Islands NAP, where they, while also prioritizing their sovereignty, also acknowledge the factor that at some point in the future, relocation will be inevitable. And last but not the least, within this case study, let's highlight the vital role that's played by local leaders in Fiji's case, which also illustrates the importance of meaningful inclusion and buy-in of the locals if we want to ensure sustainable transformational adaptation. Next slide, please. So the second case study that we've chosen is pivoted around the agricultural sector. Now, this sector has been cited as the largest holder of practical evidence of transformational adaptation. And Vietnam is a country that has been facing increased frequency of early floods, which causes like almost 90% loss of their crops. And this is a case where within this particular district, back during the time period of 2002 to 2017, farmers started experimenting a new approach, which led them to discover ratoon rice, which is basically a low-risk rice, as well as a low-maintenance crop. Now, despite the yields of ratoon rice being low, it was preferred by the farmers due to definitely the decreased risks, and because given its low maintenance, it allowed the farmers to migrate for alternative livelihood options as well. Now, initially, this approach, it was prohibited by the government, but upon further discussions between district level officials and farmers, the government was finally convinced, and the district extension officers at the local level, they basically helped by providing improved resources for this particular type of rice by connecting the farmers with the researchers. And subsequently, local policies were also modified. There were designated land areas for ratoon rice within the provinces, and subsidies were also provided. So this ultimately resulted in basically 100% shift from the conventional to ratoon rice crop in the lowlands of this district by 2013. Now, some of the takeaways from this is that it's definitely something that's autonomous in nature, a kind of adaptation that happened by its own, but it still illustrates the need for systemic change and collective actions, which are so vital to ensure sustenance. Because had the national and local government officials been unwilling to support the adoption of ratoon rice and not created the facilitated enabling environment for it, this complete shift would not have been possible. But a drawback that we see here is that this particular kind of transformation led to a complete, like 100% shift to just one single option. As it was autonomous, definitely the background study of whether this particular rice will be sustainable in the face of future climate scenarios is something that remains questionable. So out of that, we draw the recommendation that transformation adaptation should also lead to a wide range of options along different adaptation pathways, which is basically, as seen in our previous case study, when you approach it from a planned perspective, we come up with that. And for that, agricultural communities also need to be capacitated to assess from a wider set of adaptation options in which multi-stakeholder interactions will play a vital role. Next slide, please. So this is our last case study, and it's basically pivoted around the water sector in the temperate Asia sub-region, which is prone to droughts and irregular precipitation. And another thing about this case study is also that, as opposed to the previous case studies, which were either autonomous or reactive or institutional practices within plans and policies, this is basically a project-based approach, and it's within a shorter time frame. And transformational adaptation usually requires a considerable amount of length to be materialized into concrete outputs. So, but the reason that we picked this case study is that it's cited by many as having the potential to be highly transformational. So deep diving into it, it's basically Bhutan's National Adaptation Programs of Action. A project was taken to address the challenge with water scarcity, where the water sources had disappeared considerably within a certain community called Serentod. And they approached this in the project through a holistic and systemic manner, where they did provide an alternative primary water source. And alongside it, ecological trends were also redirected by systemic nature-based solutions. For example, they eradicated invasive species using native ones. Reforestation was done at a considerably large scale at the same time, so that what alternative water source developed sustains a systemic water management system was also established within the community. A women's saving group was created for water infrastructure maintenance. So acknowledging that these initiatives alone would not sustain at the systems level, they also provided complementary incremental activities such as training for understanding climate change and impacts. Now, again, reiterating that this is a project-based and a one-off example, and it does not ensure that it's going to lead to transformational adaptation if the practices are not sustained. And it also highlights the challenge of patient funding. But what is a major takeaway from this is the shift in socio-ecological systems, which is a common indicator of transformation. And so, as I said in the beginning, that the project holistically attempted to solve the water crisis by primarily focusing on nature-based solutions. Now, nature-based solutions provide long-term co-benefits, and they address multiple issues simultaneously, and thus have a large potential for delivering transformation adaptation. And at the same time, the challenges that nature-based solutions are trying to address are also cross-sectoral, and by nature call for cross-sectoral engagements, incorporation of communities' value, and multidimensionality. So further to that as well, the 8 criteria set by IUCN for defining something as nature-based solutions, some of those criteria directly speak with our understanding of transformation adaptation. So in conclusion, this particular case study had a lot of seeds of transformation basically placed, but which may or may not sprout depending upon subsequent course of action. So basically highlighting the fact that this is a very evolving complex process. So with that, I'll close the section on case studies and hand it over to Kay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madiha, for introducing the case studies conducted by ICCCAD. So for the last session of my presentation, I would like to present the policy recommendations and some keynote for the way forward. So next slide, please. So we have conducted several researches and we have presented the result. And based on the result that we have presented, we developed 8 policy recommendations. So I would like to present one by one the recommendations that we have developed for the policy brief. So the first policy recommendation is policymakers should put efforts on how to conceptualize and operationalize transformative adaptation as a meaningful term for strengthening adaptation actions. So some approaches include clarifying the relations with neighboring concepts such as sustainable development and the climate resilient development pathways, and setting indicators for what constitute good and effective transformative adaptations. The second recommendation is international processes, regional platforms, and networks should strive to foster common understanding and share good practices of transformative adaptation. And also, regional cooperation will be helpful to accelerate transformation in the Asia-Pacific region, including APAN Forum, which is actively engaging relevant stakeholders. And thirdly, governments should ensure the successful implementation of transformative adaptation by incorporating it into NAPs. Local actors should play a leading role in executing these policies with careful attention to the specific needs and context of their communities. And the fourth recommendation is that although incremental adaptation and transformative adaptation are often put in contrast, policymakers and relevant actors should understand the different functions and roles of incremental and transformative adaptation in an ideal policy mix by referring to short and long-term adaptation. Next slide, please. The fifth recommendation is as climate risk and socio-economic conditions change over time, and adaptation is an iterative process without an endpoint, transformative adaptation should be implemented through continued monitoring, review, and learning. 6, policymakers should design incentives to encourage actors to get out of their current comfort zone and spark innovative thinking and actions to enable transformative adaptation. 7th, it is necessary to ensure that policies are fair and inclusive and address historical injustice and social inequalities. So the government should take a lead in implementing transformative adaptation in an inclusive manner, involving all stakeholders and gathering aspirations with transparency and accountability. The final recommendation is that when designing and implementing transformative adaptation, it is essential to consider the significant uncertainties involved compared to incremental adaptation and to incorporate necessary measures to address these uncertainties. So I have presented the 8 policy recommendations that we have developed in the policy brief, and this will be like a framing presentation for the following panel discussions. So the last slide, please. Yeah. So in summary, so this policy brief have underscored the ongoing efforts toward transformative adaptation in the Asia-Pacific region. However, advancing these initiatives requires addressing several challenges, including financial limitations and resistance to changing established practices. As pointed out in the result and recommendation, key enablers include incentivizing innovation and embedding transformative adaptation into national and local policy frameworks. And in doing so, the government is the key actors with the support of donors, research institutions, and the private sectors. and the government should lead these efforts in just an inclusive manner by fostering international collaborations. So thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussion on fostering collaboration in the Asia Pacific within this webinar and also in the 9th APAN Forum coming up next year. Thank you very much. Okay, hand over to Akane. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kei and Madiha, for sharing the fresh outcome of the policy study. The policy brief document is now under the publication process, and it will be published early next year, so please stay tuned to APAN for the updates. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Rebecca Carter, Director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Program at the World Resource Institute, to reflect on the policy brief. WRR is one of the organizations surveyed in our study, and Dr. Rebecca was kind enough to provide comments after reading our draft policy brief. So she will join us via video message due to the time difference. So please go ahead.
Climate Adaptation and Resilience at the World Resource Institute. It's an honor to be with you today, even if only by video, to share some thoughts on this great new policy brief on enhancing regional cooperation for transformative adaptation in the Asia Pacific. So I wanted to start off by spending just a few minutes talking about sort of where the perspectives that I'm going to share on transformative adaptation come from. We spent about 3 years conducting a research project called Transforming Agriculture for Climate Resilience. And we produced a series of working papers on applying this concept of transformative adaptation to climate services and crop and livestock systems, plus the report that you see on the left that looks at sort of transformative adaptation for long-term food security. We also conducted a series of case studies in Costa Rica, Bhutan, and Ethiopia. We looked at how climate change is threatening food systems, and we offered steps for governments, funders, and researchers to take to ensure long-term food security. So our report and our work, our thinking about transformative adaptation, is based on the 2014 IPCC definitions, which I know are mentioned in the policy brief, but I wanted to go over them at the start of the presentation just so that we're all kind of on the same page. So the IPCC defines incremental adaptation first as actions where the central aim is to maintain the essence and integrity of the existing technological, institutional, and governance and value systems. The IPCC also says that transformative adaptation, in contrast, seeks to change the fundamental attributes of systems in response to actual or expected climate and its effects at a scale and ambition often greater than incremental activities. So we applied this IPCC definition to agricultural systems and kind of identified 3 main ways that we see transformation taking place. The first was relocation. In Costa Rica, we found examples of, in the drier northwestern part of the country, it was becoming too hot for coffee, and therefore the farmers there were shifting over to citrus production, so growing something new, while coffee production was becoming more possible in cooler locations. In Brazil, we found examples of where livestock systems were suffering because of drought and the cattle were not finding enough forage to eat. So those farmers were shifting over to irrigated agriculture. And in India, we found examples where a new technology or methodology was really making it possible to produce new and different types of crops and significantly changing the system. Farmers there started using these weather-resistant polyhouses and found that they enabled them to grow a much broader range of vegetables than they had been able to before. So moving on to the comments on policy recommendations, and throughout this presentation, I'll be kind of combining different policy recommendations where I thought they had commonalities, whether this suggests to the writing team that, anything be restructured is, of course, entirely up to you, but this is just how I thought about the paper and my comments on it. So the first recommendation there was the policymakers should put efforts on how to conceptualize and operationalize transformative adaptation as a meaningful term for strengthening adaptation actions. I very much agree. I mean, this term tends to be quite overused to mean everything. Sometimes, anything that could be classified as bigger and better adaptation is considered transformative, whereas I would say it's really systemic change. So it's something different than incremental adaptation. Same with number 4, policymakers and relevant actors should understand the different functions and roles of incremental and transformative adaptation. I completely agree also that more specificity in what we mean by this term is needed. And I just wanted to put an idea on the table, some thinking that we've done after the reports and the papers that I mentioned were published, and that's thinking about where transformative adaptation fits in with mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, right? So they're all meant to reduce negative climate impacts. With mitigation, we're trying to avert negative climate impacts. With adaptation, we're trying to minimize the harm that they do. With loss and damage, that's when we acknowledge that, harm has already been suffered, and the best that we can do is address those losses and damages. So I would say that a lot of just sort of conventional adaptation is of the more incremental type where we can minimize loss and damage. But the transformative adaptation comes in when we would really need to change systems in order to avert losses and damages, or actually to minimize and address them. So I would say the transformative adaptation should be employed when systems are at such high risk of loss and damage that incremental adaptation is not likely to be sufficient, and instead the entire system needs to be altered pretty substantially. So moving on with the policy recommendations, the second one there dealt with international processes, regional platforms, and networks fostering common understanding and good practices. And I completely agree. Ecosystems, trade, and economic systems extend beyond borders, as do flows of climate migrants and refugees when adaptation fails to protect them. And because of that, a regional approach is particularly important. I would also say that the report could be a bit more specific about what some of the international processes, for example, are doing with the concept of transformative adaptation, like saying a little bit more on how the UNFCCC is considering transformative adaptation within the process of establishing the global goal on adaptation. Moving on. Policy recommendation number 3, government should ensure that the successful implementation of transformative adaptation by incorporating it into national adaptation plans, SNAPs, and NDCs. I would agree with that. And I just wanted to share the results of this analysis that we did of all the first and second adaptation NDCs, right? So all of the actions within them, and then also a handful of NAPs just to get a handle on what is included in them, including transformative adaptation. And as you can see there in the box that's circled in red, very few governments were including transformative adaptation in either their NAPs or NDCs when we conducted this analysis. And it'll be interesting to see when we update the analysis whether more are including it. A couple more policy recommendations. Governments should take the lead in implementing transformative adaptation in an inclusive manner. There's also a second part to number 3, which dealt with local actors and said that they should play a leading role in executing these policies with careful attention to the specific needs and context of their communities. I would completely agree. The case studies that we did in Bhutan, Ethiopia, and Costa Rica indicated that while local actors can start transformative adaptation and begin systems change, they can't really transform entire systems on their own, and therefore governments do need to play a key role if systems are to be changed, as transformative adaptation indicates, but that local people also need to be extremely involved in planning and implementing transformative adaptation. And I liked the paper included mention of combining transformative adaptation with locally led adaptation. Bringing together 3 more policy recommendations, that I thought all dealt with sort of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Number 8, number 5, and again, that second part of number 3 about local actors. Number 8 talks about greater uncertainty. And to me, that says that we need actually more rigorous monitoring, about evaluation and learning, and adaptive management. Then we might with incremental adaptation to ensure that progress is being made and also that maladaptation is being avoided. But again, I would say that local actors are the ones who should be conducting a lot of the monitoring, evaluation, and learning from their perspective, right? To say, this is what transformative adaptation looks like where we are, and this is how transformative policies are playing out in our communities. And then a final recommendation that I wanted to look at, number 6 there, policymakers should design incentives to encourage actors to get out of current comfort zones and spark innovative thinking and actions to enable transformative adaptation. Absolutely. We found in our research that it is very true that path dependency or inertia, political risks, traditional identities, and sometimes local cultures can make change difficult. You know, people are quite reluctant in many cases to change things just to change them, and when they're not quite sure why this is necessary or who's driving the change. But we also found that when local groups and local actors are brought into deciding what the transformative change would be and have a real role in implementing it, you know, when they're offered new options and opportunities, when their entrepreneurial spirit is cultivated so that they can see new opportunities, and when there are mechanisms placed, like maybe insurance, to reduce their risks of trying new and transformative ways of adapting, they're often much more receptive to them. And I see that my time is about up, so I am going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a wonderful discussion. Wish I could be there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rebecca, for providing detailed reflections on each policy recommendations we provided in the policy brief. It was really encouraging that you agreed with most of the points we made and even restructuring them with some additional aspects such as loss and damage and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I also wish you were here today for the following discussion, but anyway, thank you very much. Okay, so now we would like to move to the panel discussion segment. So let me invite our 5 panelists here. Okay, so yeah, today we have panels from 2 government representatives and 3 representatives from international organizations. So there are 2 questions for each panelist, and I will request all the panelists to answer both the questions due to the time at once, due to the time constraint. So without further ado, let's start asking questions to the panelists. Sorry, can you go to the organization slides? Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so the first question, actually this will be the common question for all of the panelists. Could you give us some comments on the policy recommendations that we presented, which are included in a policy brief? And do you have any further recommendations or reflections for achieving transformative adaptation in the region? And the second question is specific for organizations. What can APAN and its networks do in the Asia-Pacific region to further work on achieving transformative adaptation throughout the region? So may I invite first Dr. Bapon Phakphudin, sorry, my pronunciation. He's the water sector lead of Green Climate Fund. Dr. Bapon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chair, Akin, for inviting us. It's been a pleasure to listening the key recommendations, which was actually quite resonant with the way actually the GCF also actually tried to promote the transformative climate action. Though we don't have any particular definition on the transformative adaptation, but if you look at our metrics or investment criteria, we always actually try to look at transformative adaptation and mitigation, because we are looking more on the climate action, both 50-50 adaptation and mitigation side. And it's obviously need to be through a country need-based or country-owned partnership approach, focusing on both adaptation and mitigation and supporting to our most vulnerable communities. So if I just reflect based on your policy recommendation and how does actually it could reflect into the climate financing structure. So if you look at it in a GCF, our investment criteria, we try to look at actually 6 fundamental principles, which actually we think that key enabler for ensuring a transformative adaptation, or you can talk about transformative mitigation side, depending on how you actually packaging your project. So one is actually to looking at actually, obviously it need to be, and also it need to be a systematic, which you already presented in your policy brief, that how we actually look at full system approach or value chain over the end-to-end approach, and what kind of impact it actually creating the project into the ground, so that actually the beneficiary is actually getting benefit. I think it's still there is a little bit lacking on proper understanding on that side, that how we actually calculate those beneficiary, or how we understand actually the adaptation project. Is it only a number of beneficiary that just supported, or amount of emission that we are reducing? So I think that need to be a little bit more holistically look at that, what are the indirect impact it's creating, and how we can actually calculate those kind of impact to really understanding the climate impact. And secondly, obviously the paradigm shift, what we are talking about out here, we are talking about transformative adaptation, that what kind of paradigm shift you're bringing, not only just things you will be doing because climate change is emerging, but you have to, so that emerging changes need to be looked at in a little bit different than the traditional way. So what are the new way of doing things, and how actually the new way of financing things? So how that could be make a long-term sustainability over the period of time. So that's one of the key indicator that GCF try to apply into their investment criteria. And then obviously the Sustainable Development Goal, that how we actually achieve those SDGs, which was also, I see that quite strongly reflecting your recommendation in the policy brief. And then obviously everything needs to be owned by the country. So the country ownership is quite important, but also it needs to be a country need-based adaptation, so that it can reflect those kind of transformation that are actually country-owned partnerships could be reflected. And then finally, actually the efficiency and effectiveness on that activity that we are actually trying to promote through the transformative adaptation, that the value of money, or how much actually we are investing, what kind of benefit it's actually creating. So those are the things is quite important. And if you can actually reflect your policy brief or recommendation, how that actually articulates some of those climate financing architecture, I think that would be quite easy for government or our partner or country who is actually packaging such kind of project to articulate the transformative adaptation into their practices. And obviously, as you correctly mentioned, that actually there is a vocabulary issue. So how actually we change those kind of vocabulary and having a common understanding as well as definition, so that it could be properly utilized, that what does we mean by transformative adaptation into practice. And I think APAN is actually plays a critical role in that perspective, looking at your second aspect, because it is an advocacy agency, and how actually you try to provide those kind of advocacy to the countries and actually enable to engaging country to integrate such kind of policy brief into their policy plan or strategy plan, as well as investment plan through NDC and NAP processes, and how that could be actually then packaged to developing proposal or accessing the financing from various climate finance or development finance, whoever actually trying to support adaptation benefit into their programming. I think those are the maybe just few reflections from our side. But otherwise, we really thank you for the researcher who actually lead this research, and look forward to see the final document upfront. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bapon, for clearly answering the questions through the lens of climate, financing institute. And I heard Dr. Bapon has to leave the webinar in the meantime. So if you have any questions to him, please leave the message in the Q&A chat box, and we will take care of them later. Yeah, and sorry, I forgot to mention earlier, but yeah, some people raised hand in the Zoom function. Thank you very much for that. But as I mentioned earlier, please ask your questions through Q&A chat box if you have any. We will have Q&A session at the end after this panel discussion. Okay, so let's go to the next panelist. Now we will go to the government representatives to ask questions. So sorry, can you show the question to the government representatives? Thank you very much. So the two questions to the government representatives. The first question will be the same, the reflection of this policy brief. And the second question will be, what are the barriers and challenges to achieving transformative adaptation in your country, and what kind of support is needed? So with this question, may I invite Mr. Zabel Matsutaro, National Climate Change Coordinator, Office of Climate Change, Office of the President, Republic of Palau. Zabel-san, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you first and foremost very much for having me here. It's quite a privilege to speak to you, to give us some insights on Palau's perspective, but I would also argue that it's in general the perspectives of the Pacific region, as we've been working quite hard to try and figure out how can we enhance the level of effectiveness of adaptations within our respective countries, but also as within the region as a whole. So just a quick reflection on the policy brief. I think it's quite spot on. This idea of transformative adaptation, it really is a concept that needs to be further defined, but then in addition to that, maybe even further contextualized. Because different regions and sub-regions might have different contexts, and therefore what is meant by transformative adaptation may look a little bit differently with some nuances that would need to be had in order for the level of effectiveness to be transformative. Maybe just to add on the what could potentially be included is really from a SIDS context is the capacity and capability constraints. It's just really few manpower trying to deliver measures at the scale that's needed. And with the growing number of actors that are coming into the space, the other challenge is really coordinating all of the different potential partners so that we reduce duplicating efforts, or actually then get into adaptation measures that actually cause maladaptation. So there's been a lot of effort to try and get ourselves a little bit more coordinated and leveraging the PCIDS as a region, acting more as one unit. That way we have more manpower, more people in the think tank to address our issues collectively when it comes to enhancing adaptation efforts. And so this, I guess, kind of segues to some of the barriers and challenges. I think the other thing to highlight, and this has been mentioned earlier, is that the measures are small scale, short-term and sporadic. And so you never really get the opportunity to reach the full potential of the adaptation measures that we then implement. And so what do we do to address this? There is this collective effort to then transition from those short-term pathways to more long-term pathways. And also with the long-term pathways, you're going to need higher level of access to finances to then address those pathways. But then the idea is to transition from more of a project level, a project timescale timeframe to something more programmatic. And the idea is to see if it's a longer term from, say, 5 years moving into 10 years, then you can have a more systems approach to addressing the needs on the ground. And accompanied by that is substantial capacity and capability components that complements and is compatible with national systems, mainly because the systems within the Pacific area are quite small and limited. And so capacity support to build, to strengthen our ability to deliver against our priorities, and capabilities including having supplemental support in order to, again, improve the delivery of the interventions that are needed. And with that, we're actually moving forward with this kind of initiative, leveraging from different actors. So that coordination bit, we're actually working with 3 accredited entities. SPREP, who is one of the sponsors of this, is one of them, and pooling different actors that are providing support or helping us access the support in a coordinated manner, so that you can have a higher level of finance that is needed, but done in a way that is supported by a bit of a reform in the way that the finance is being accessed and delivered in a time scale that is more suitable for our context. Come next week, we're actually going to be meeting with the Green Climate Fund to discuss this approach, backed by a concept note that's been developed, and really we're quite keen to submitting this concept note and progress it to the project design, so that we can start really looking at the details on how best to address the needs of the individual countries within the region. So I hope this is helpful. It providing a bit of a window. This is an effort that we've been undertaking now for about two years, and we're quite excited to potentially see it come into fruition, and if at all possible, sooner rather than later, because we're kind of in a race against time in terms of meeting the needs and addressing the climate change impacts. I appreciate your time, and happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zavil, for answering the question. Yes, I understand transformative adaptation needs more diverse actors with longer term planning and implementation to achieve the systemic change. And for that, it's really exciting to know that being as a SPREP, the Pacific countries have already started collective actions and trying to start discussion with GCF in this regard. So thank you very much. Okay, now I'd like to move to the next speaker from the government of Indonesia, Mr. Hendra Yusran Sari, Senior Advisor to Minister on Ecology and Marine Resource Affairs, Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Indonesia. So the same 2 questions goes to you. So Mr. Hendra, please take the floor.
Right. First, thank you very much for the opportunity to invite me to be a panelist for this important technical webinar. And I just would like to inform you that we just have a new government, and we have a new president and vice president just changing in 20 of October. And then also we have the new cabinet here, and there is some changes to the cabinet, which is implied to impact to the UNFCCC focal point, because previously the last 10 years, we have the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. Now they split into Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Forestry. And of course, I would like to convey my congratulations, also the appreciation for the policy brief and also very effective informative session. I listening about the concept of the transformative adaptations. And I would like to start my comment with this question by mentioning here that the terms of transformative adaptations is regularly we don't not yet appear in our formal submitted documents to the UNFCCC, and we don't have any this term to reflect a process or outcome lead to the different potential indicators of success from adaptation action of climate change. And as a new concept, for us, I think transformative adaptation needs more familiarizations to our adaptation efforts. And I agree with Xavier because there will be diverse terminology, but we need to also with Bapon, we need to make sure that the right terminology that we define transformative adaptation in the right way, and then it can cover the diversity of interpretation from each country. And of course, we need to understand this concept beyond as the mantra for the multilateral organization and the significant investment criterion for many international climate funds. And I think I checked with our national communication and also our national adaptation plan. The word of transformative adaptation is not yet appear as not yet exist as we hope that. But I would like to share here. There is a paper that the title is a transformational adaptation in the context of the coastal cities. This is by Laura Hu in 2021. This can be provide how the transformational adaptation they use terminology of transformational adaptation instead of transformative adaptation. But in here, the interesting from the study here because they provide example of Jakarta, Indonesia as coastal megacity, which face the high risk of flooding and also the alarming rate of the land subsidence. So this is very substantial because we need to address it. We need to minimize risk. And the current adaptation measures focus on heavily on traditional engineering solutions. We also found it the informal settlements have been identified as one of the causes of flooding, and as they take up space for the needed of the water retention and installation of the flood protection infrastructure. There is a concept what we call designation of capital integrated coastal development master plan, which is in the last 5 years is already proposed as the world's largest flood wall, and will turn to Jakarta Bay into the sea-led reservoir. There will be what we call this reservoir for the 13 rivers in around Jakarta. And the plan is envisioned as transformation of the city hydrology and meteorology, including the reclamation and artificial islands of the development of the new seafront for the commercial and residential purposes. And there is some approach for the criteria, a large scale of adaptation. But of course, this master plan has some resistance because it can be like how we address the resettlement low-income household and then to enforce them to transform into the existing social ecological system, which will be potential can be marginalized or can be vulnerability for them. And the what we call this this plan as well is also can be seen as a demonstrated the challenges of relying on engineering approaches to the transformation, because the master plan itself can cause the widespread protests. This is also led to the moratorium for the construction of the seawall due to the social unrest and associated settlement necessitated by the construction of the seawall. And the interesting now, because one of the candidates or the Jakarta governor used this to become promises, political promises for the government. So this is just like the example that I would like to bring to this discussion, but also to address the second question about what the capacity need. I think since this is a new concept, we need the more more socialize this concept into our national context, and if there is some how to measure and then how to make sure that we are step into the progressive adaptation effort, and how to measure it, and then how to put it into the, probably we can say this, into the quantitative effort. We need the capacity building for this. But more importantly, the concept itself, we need to make sure in our updated NDC can be sound. But again, this is need to avoid the resistance from the people that that see that adaptations can be simple as concept as it is, instead of putting adjective like transformative adaptation. But this is some challenge. And I would like to comment that some of the 10 recommendations provided by the researchers, I would like, and some agree with the WRI, some from the presentation. And this is, of course, this is some valid recommendation for moving forward, for how to make sure that transformative adaptation will be in place as mandated by the UN request. By saying that, I would like to conclude my intervention. Thank you very much, and look forward to getting more comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hendra, for explaining the current status of adaptation planning in your country, and also about the transformative adaptation. Thank you very much for introducing some additional examples in the context of coastal cities, highlighting the examples from Jakarta city. And regarding the support as well, yes, it is very true that the more, I think, mutual learning to enhance the understanding of transformative adaptation in each context, or country context, is important, including the measurement of such adaptation. And I hope our policy brief will be of support to deepen the understanding of this new concept. So now I would like to move to the next panelist. So we finished two panelists from government. So now I'd like to go back to the organizations. So firstly, I'd like to invite Ms. Athena Danis Galau, Program Coordinator, Gender and Climate Action, UN Women. So Ms. Athena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Akane, and it's nice to meet everyone. I hope you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so from my side, so I'm Athena. I work with UN Women in advancing the gender and climate portfolio. So what I've seen so far, and I'll be maybe a bit brief, is that like we've seen the presentations from Kay and the case studies. And what we've seen so far is that there's positive indication when gender equality and social inclusion is integrated, there's more plausibility or propensity for transformative adaptation. So I think that tells us a lot of the value of gender equality in really driving more transformative actions. So just a quick reflection from my side in terms of TA or transformative adaptation is that I mean, it is kind of a paradigm shift in terms of looking at having more clarity in terms of the ambition of where we want to go as a society, and also the scale that is needed, because we've seen like many adaptation solutions being put forth, and I've just came from APM CDRR and also a dialogue on gender and climate. So we've seen like there's solutions that are put forth, but the scalability is one of the key things that we look for. Another thing that I really like about TA is that it looks at a clear understanding of vulnerability and the need to address historical inequalities. Having said that, I think what it offers is from a gender perspective is that it offers a concrete way for different types of stakeholders, including women's groups, civil society organizations, in looking at how they can really support adaptation solutions. So one key thing is I want to put forth, because I'm a gender specialist, is that child marriage, for instance, is something that we look at as one of the key climate impacts, right? But in reality, child marriages exist even without climate. I mean, it exists because there are harmful discriminatory social practices in countries. Without having we for instance, as climate practitioners, don't see the links of climate marriage and child marriage and climate adaptation. But in reality, if you look at climate marriage from not an impact perspective, but a preparedness or resilience building, that it does hamper the ability of women and the most at-risk groups to really be part of resilience building, because it limits their access to education, it reinforces gender roles. So having a transformative adaptation lens provides us with opportunities to look at other types of issues that were not critically looked at in the traditional sense of adaptation. The last thing I would want to say is that, I mean, in terms of reflections on transformative adaptation, is it does provide the emphasis of a whole of society approach, and we're in partnerships, genuine partnerships across duty bearers, governments, development partners, women's organizations, and civil society is centerfold. So I think having those have been, I mean, we saw the policy recommendations where government is the seventh recommendation where government is to lead TA, but I agree with Rebecca. The government, of course, is the primary duty bearer, but we also see the role of different actors, including local communities, women's organizations, as integral to this process. So I heard also from governments, and these are some of the reflections I've had on TA. Like, of course, it's not all rainbows and sunshines, because we also need to operationalize a new concept concretely to be able to advance critical actions. So one thing is, the questions that come to mind is really, how do we really create something that's truly bottom up and tries to really challenge power dynamics? Because a lot of the social inequalities are not just, exposure, but they're also like clearly embedded power dynamics that exist within communities and societies. And they're one of the key challenges that I've seen also from Kay, is that there might be some resistance because these power dynamics exist. So that's one question I had. The second question is that we heard from GCF and also from Palau in Indonesia about the cost of adaptation, and it's really quite high. I've sat in meetings where the discussions were, this was not on NAP also. So because a lot of the NAPs, for instance, Bangladesh NAP, Nepal NAP, Philippines NAP, some of them also articulate that there is a financing gap in terms of advancing the adaptation solutions outlined in the NAP. And then we also hear, for instance, from Cambodia last week, where only 23% of their NDCs is funded. So we hear about these financing gap, and 30% of financing for climate actually is anchored on domestic funding. So how do we really maximize different types of financing to be able to advance the transformative climate solutions? So the third one I want to emphasize is that there has to be really some clarity on how to operationalize what the roles of, I mean, apart from the common understanding of what it is, but more of understanding what the roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders. How do we build on existing frameworks? For instance, disaster risk reduction is one of the key things that maybe we can build on, because it also looks at addressing vulnerabilities, like the root causes of vulnerabilities, or looking at development solutions, or even gender equality. So how do we leverage the different types of frameworks that exist to be able to harness the full potential of transformative adaptation? The third one I want to highlight is that the need for gender environment data. And we heard so much about how do we really measure outcomes. And I know GGA is now creating a pool of indicators, but now that we're discussing transformative adaptation and want it to be adopted at the national level, like how do we really maximize data or like create, produce, and also utilize data to be able to measure not just, to be able to use data that also measures access and control over resources or decision making or gender roles. So all of these are also has to be integrated in order for us to really measure adaptive capacity. The last point I want to make is on financing. In terms of financing, we also see one of the key things I've said like so much about there's not enough money going around to fund adaptation solutions, and we all know that difference where 0.04% only of ODA goes to has gender equality as a primary objective. But what we need to build along with creating the space for transformative adaptation is a economical and financial case, so other actors can also support in financing the goals that we have. So in terms of APAN, which is the last question, and I'm sorry if maybe I did go, maybe not, is that I think APAN has always built fostered a dialogue across different types of stakeholders. And I think that is very critical if you really want to shift the perspectives on how do we do adaptation. That space has to really be strengthened. And I think APAN holds a very, very critical role in making sure it has. Another thing is we have many, I would say that adaptation has been there since I started working on adaptation, which is, I don't know, 15 years ago. So more than before I started working. So I think APAN also has a role in terms of documenting the different types of experiences and practices and creating that practitioner dialogue, really to harness those different types of experiences and really provide a clear pathway for the different types of actors in the region to harness those experiences and measure, of course, the outcomes of those experiences. So having said that, I think I answered both your questions. Akane, or
Yes,
am I on
you
time?
did. Yes,
Okay,
great.
thank you so much. But happy to answer any questions on adaptation and what we can do to collaborate. Thank you so much. Over to you, Akane.
Thank you very much, Athena, for very passionately answered our questions. So your point on the reflection of the policy brief is about the scalability and the transformative adaptation as an opportunity to to tackle the historical inequality issues, also the importance of whole of society approach. And also thank you very much for sharing your questions came to your mind about how to create the bottom-up approach, and of course how to fill the financing gap for transformative adaptation, and finally operationalization of transformative adaptation, especially by utilizing this opportunity of GGA discussion happening under UNFCCC negotiation. And also thank you very much for sharing the important role of APAN as a place to keep continuing dialogue related to this adaptation issues. Okay, so I'd like to now go to the final panelist, who is Miss Julie Amoroso Garbin. She's a regional lead, UNFCCC, RCC, Asia, and the Pacific. So I would like to hear the answers of the same two questions. Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Akane. And it's actually a tough, role to play following all the previous speakers before me. But maybe what I can do is maybe focus on one particular thing that were mentioned also by the others, but maybe I could also provide more reflections on that. But before that, allow me to thank UNEP, APAN, and also IGES and all the contributors to this policy paper for their very detailed recommendations and for the work that you have done. Considering the growing urgency of climate impacts, we now see the need to emphasize transformational adaptation, a concept that is recently gaining prominence. But I know for sure that if you look at the different initiatives or projects, there might be some indications in terms of whether a certain intervention is transformational or incremental. Having said this, maybe I could also provide a reflection on the methodology of the study, as I notice, of course, that we are looking at the different instruments or documents or plans that were submitted to the UNFCCC as one of the data that could inform how transformational adaptation is being incorporated by the different countries or parties to the UNFCCC. And I see that, of course, there can be a big gap if we look at just the word search and looking at just the numbers on how many have made mention of transformational adaptation. And in the discussion today, we realized that we could actually look into case studies. And in fact, the real indicators could be found in the design and implementation of the adaptation interventions, perhaps looking into the project proposals or the reports of how these projects are actually implemented. This could also inform us in terms of identifying, or determining better indicators or variables to define whether the intervention is indeed transformational, and also look at which variables are dependent on each other. So that's one. So now I would like to focus on the policy recommendations and perhaps looking into how could we operationalize transformational adaptation through national adaptation plans as a way to drive long-term and systemic changes. So national adaptation plans, as outlined in the UNFCCC process, are the main vehicle for planning and implementing adaptation actions. So embedding transformational adaptation in apps is essential to shifting from reactive incremental approaches to forward-looking and systemic change. Countries, those who are still developing their national adaptation plan, should integrate transformational goals into their national adaptation plans, ensuring that long-term resilience strategies are linked to major climate risks like sea level rise or extreme weather events and ecosystem degradation, to name a few. Transformational actions, as we have learned as well in this conversation, is that it is not one-dimensional. It's actually multi-dimensional, and in fact may occur in different aspects or stages of the national adaptation plans. In doing your assessment, in terms of planning, in terms of designing and implementing your adaptation policies, projects, and programs. The global goal on adaptation, highlighted in the Paris Agreement, also emphasizes both incremental and transformational adaptation. And the UNFCCC is currently working to refine the operational definition of transformational adaptation and provide guidance for countries to include it in their NAPs. The LDC expert group, the least developed countries expert group, who is the mandated constituted body to provide guidance on NAPs, is also looking into how they could update the guidance on NAPs to better integrate transformational adaptation. Now we looked at capacity building and governance, and most of the speakers before me had alluded to this as well. Effective implementation of transformational adaptation requires strong governance structure and local capacity building. And NAPS could emphasize creating these decentralized governance systems that empower local actors to drive transformative changes. Governments should also ensure that continuous learning and adaptation through national adaptation plans, which should include mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation. This will help the countries adjust their approaches as new climate challenges emerge. we can also talk about innovative financing and long-term investments. And again, earlier, some speakers before me had already alluded to this, that transformational adaptation requires significant and long-term financial commitments, and mobilizing support from innovative and other sources would be critical to this. And NAP should be the foundation for accessing international climate finance mechanisms, including the Green Climate Fund, to fund large-scale and transformative projects. As of date, NAP is the only instrument under the UNFCCC which could facilitate this, because it enjoys a clear funding coming from the GCF, both on the formulation and implementation of the policies plans, the policies, programs, and projects identified in the NAPs, as espoused in the decision in the Paris Agreement. Also, we talk about cross-sectoral coordination through national adaptation plans. And again, the NAPs provide the opportunity to ensure cross-sectoral coordination to achieve transformational adaptation. We know that it's transformational adaptation is not just it's not just dependent on the government. It's on the government side, as Athena also mentioned earlier. It espouses the whole of society, whole of government approaches. So it needs to include the different stakeholders and ensure that it also integrates the different systems like health, water management, urban development, and others. So in conclusion, the National Adaptation Plan can serve as an engine for transformation. So rather than looking at building a new instrument, so we should strengthen the role of NAPs in driving transformative adaptation. And under the UNFCCC, the NAPs are the most effective tool for translating transformational adaptation from global goals into actionable and local solutions. So moving into the second question, in terms of how can APAN mobilize adaptation knowledge on this. Just in addition to what Athena had already mentioned, maybe perhaps provide additional platforms where we could expand understanding on transformational adaptation, taking into account, of course, the traditional knowledge, the indigenous people's knowledge, and the best available science, and perhaps also diversify the expertise, for instance, in these conversations, taking into account all of these sort of sectors as well. And then perhaps also promoting or supporting research and development in the region when we talk about transformational adaptation. I'll stop there, Akane. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide my input. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Julie, for sharing your insights and information on how the UNFCCC is currently working on transformative adaptation and sharing the potential of NAP as an engine of transformative adaptation. I think everybody really look for the further information through your new NAP guidance, as well as the report on the definition of transformative adaptation at COP29. So thank you very much. Sorry, the time is almost up, but now I would like to, regarding the question and answer, thank you very much for asking some questions through chat box, and those already answered through chat, but any additional questions to anybody is always welcome. So if you have any additional comments or questions about today's webinar, please feel free to send an email to us. Okay, so before going to the closing session, may I invite you to again to join a short survey through Zoom poll. So there are 4 simple questions to answer about today's webinar. Okay, so thank you very much for joining the Zoom poll. So to close our session, Now, I'd like to invite Ms. Philomena Nelson, Climate Change Adaptation Advisor from SREB. So, Philomena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm not gonna take up much more time, given that we've reached the end of the webinar. I just want to take the opportunity to thank UNEP and APAN Secretary, and as well as your partners in organizing this webinar. I think the discussion and the thoughts being shared by panel members and speakers are very, very important and very useful. I think one of the key things for future webinars, I think we really need to try and get more speakers on the real experiences and the case studies around transformational adaptation. I think that would be useful in terms of learning as well. One thing I haven't heard from the panel members, or maybe I missed it, is around culture, traditional knowledge and cultural practices and engagement of our traditional leadership in the Pacific region. You know, traditional governance and leadership in decision making is very, very important. Without their endorsement, nothing will work on the ground or will go on the ground. So I think it's important that transformational adaptation is discussed with traditional leaders, with various groups in our communities, in our islands, because we've heard throughout the webinar about, donor criteria on transformational adaptation and all of that. But what's important is that transformational adaptation is discussed by our traditional leaders and the different groups within our communities, because we need to hear from them what they think transformative adaptation actions that could be taken into consideration. We've also heard around the use of national adaptation planning processes in the Pacific. 8 countries are currently going through national adaptation planning processes, including Palau as well, to develop their national adaptation plans. And I think this is an important opportunity for to bring in that topic of transformational adaptation for communities and key stakeholders to really discuss what it means to them and what can be done to address that. One other point that I really want to bring up, and I know Xavier have referred to this, is around access to climate finance, because all the adaptation action in the Pacific region are externally funded. Yeah, and so we cannot afford, implementing adaptation by project that is no longer working. So what the Pacific region have done, and we've started that process, is to try and come up with the APACA, or this is the regional programmatic approach to climate action. And I think it's one of the innovative ways of trying to access financing that could be made available for implementation of, say, adaptation solutions over a longer period of time. We cannot drive transformational adaptation within, 5 years, for example. That doesn't work anymore. And so I think it's important that for the next webinar, and I think it's important that we continue to have this kind of conversations, whether it's through webinar or side events at COPs or maybe the NEP expos, to really bring forward some of those examples of transformational adaptation. And I just want to say that and also to thank everyone who spoke during this webinar, and for all the participants who posed questions, and also for the information that has been shared. And I think that that's very, very important. And I look forward to the report from this event as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philomena, for your closing message with very important points for our future continuous discussions on this topic. Thank you very much. So now we completed all the agenda for today's session. Yes, you can see the result of post-webinar survey. Thank you very much for putting the good good rating for today's webinar. Thank you very much. So now, before closing the webinar, we would like to take group photo for all the panelists, speakers. So could you please turn on your video for all the speakers? All right, thank you very much. Now everybody's here. Okay, so Secretary, please capture the screen.
Okay,
Okay,
1, 2, 3, smile. One more. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll
Thank you
see
for
you
the
in the next
opportunity.
webinar or the next 9th APAN forum. And please also stay tuned with APAN on the publication on the launch of the Transformative Adaptation Policy Brief next year. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
everyone.
day.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Babu. Thanks, Julie. Bye.
Bye.